In the darkest days of the Cold War, when the world stood divided between freedom and tyranny, when the Iron Curtain cast its shadow across Europe, and when millions lived under the boot of communist oppression, America stood as the beacon of hope for the free world. The United States, along with its Western allies Britain and France, had defeated Nazi Germany and liberated Europe from fascism, only to find half the continent falling under a new dictatorship, this time wearing the red flag of Soviet communism. But America did not abandon those trapped behind the Iron Curtain. In the heart of divided Berlin, surrounded by 155 kilometers of Soviet-controlled territory, West Berlin stood as an island of freedom, protected by American, British, and French forces, a shining testament to the Western world's commitment to liberty and human dignity. And it was in this crucible of the Cold War, in the shadow of the most infamous symbol of communist oppression ever constructed, that one of the most extraordinary acts of human courage and defiance would take place. This is the story of Tunnel 57, the single most successful escape operation in the history of the Berlin Wall, a story of love, sacrifice, heroism, and the indomitable human spirit's refusal to accept captivity. This is a story that reminds us why America fought the Cold War, why freedom is worth defending, and why tyranny, no matter how powerful, can never truly imprison the human soul.
On August 13, 1961, the citizens of Berlin awoke to find their city being torn in half. Overnight, without warning, the communist government of East Germany, officially known as the German Democratic Republic, began erecting a barrier that would come to symbolize everything wrong with totalitarianism. They called it an anti-fascist protection rampart, but the world knew it by its true name, the Berlin Wall. Streetcar tracks were ripped up and rolled into barricades, paving stones were pulled from the ground and piled high, and guards were posted over every sewer manhole. Paramilitary workers worked frantically to fence off 193 streets that had once connected the eastern and western sectors of the city. Families were split in an instant, lovers were separated, friends found themselves on opposite sides of an impenetrable barrier. The message from the communist government was clear and brutal: no one leaves. If you were born in the East, you would die in the East, whether you wanted to or not. But understand this, the Berlin Wall was not built to keep people out, it was built to keep people in. Between 1949 and 1961, before the wall went up, approximately 3.8 million people had fled from East Germany to the West. They voted with their feet, choosing freedom over the so-called workers' paradise of communism. The mass exodus was bleeding the communist state dry, draining it of its most talented citizens, its doctors, its engineers, its teachers, and its young people who saw no future under totalitarian rule. The wall was an admission of failure, a confession that communism could only survive by imprisoning its own population. As President John F. Kennedy would later say during his famous visit to Berlin, freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. The Berlin Wall was not just a physical barrier, it evolved into a sophisticated killing machine, a death strip designed with cold efficiency to stop anyone who dared to dream of freedom. The final iteration of the wall included a concrete barrier 12 feet high, topped with a smooth pipe to prevent anyone from getting a handhold. Behind that was a signal fence that triggered alarms when touched. Then came the death strip itself, a wide expanse of sand, raked smooth every day so that footprints would be immediately visible, dotted with steel spikes meant to stop vehicles, illuminated by blinding floodlights at night, and overlooked by guard towers manned by soldiers with orders to shoot to kill. More than 100 people would die trying to cross this barrier. An estimated 250,000 more would be detained as political prisoners for attempting to escape. The youngest victim was just 1 year old, the oldest was 80. This was the reality of life behind the Iron Curtain, the reality that the free world, led by the United States, stood against with unwavering resolve.
In this climate of fear and oppression, a group of young people refused to accept the status quo. They were students, mostly from the Free University in West Berlin, young men and women in their early 20s who had the audacity to believe that freedom was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. Among them was a 21-year-old civil engineering student named Joachim Neumann, a man whose personal story embodies the tragedy of a divided Germany and the triumph of the human spirit over tyranny. Neumann had grown up in Cottbus, a city about 125 kilometers southeast of Berlin, in the Soviet-occupied zone that would become East Germany. He was just a few credits away from earning his engineering degree when he made the most important decision of his life: he would escape to the West. In 1961, before the wall went up but when escape was already dangerous, Neumann obtained a borrowed passport from a Swiss student. The plan was audacious and terrifying. He would walk through the checkpoint at Friedrichstrasse S-Bahnhof, one of the crossing points between East and West Berlin, and hope that the border guards would not detect that he was using false papers. Neumann knew the risks all too well. He knew about Hohenschönhausen, the notorious Stasi prison where suspected defectors were detained indefinitely under conditions designed to break the human spirit. He knew that the Stasi, the East German secret police, were brutal and relentless in their persecution of anyone attempting to flee. But he also knew that staying meant living under a regime that denied basic human freedoms, that told you what you could read, what you could say, where you could work, and where you could not go. As Neumann stood in line at the checkpoint clutching his false Swiss passport, his pockets stuffed with movie ticket stubs and public transportation tickets that the Swiss student had thoughtfully included as supporting evidence of his identity, a moment of panic seized him. He realized that there was no way he could convincingly adopt a Swiss accent. If the guards asked him questions, his German would immediately identify him as a German national, not a Swiss tourist. In that moment of crisis, Neumann made a decision that probably saved his life. He decided to play the part of an arrogant Swiss tourist, the kind of insufferable visitor who looks down on everything and everyone around him. When the guards tried to make small talk, asking what he thought of Germany's capital city, Neumann stuck his nose in the air and harumphed. Follow-up questions elicited nothing but growls and grunts of disdain. The guards, their national pride wounded and their patience exhausted, waved him through in disgust. Joachim Neumann was free. But freedom came at a terrible cost. Neumann had left behind almost everyone he loved, his family, his friends, and most painfully, his long-term girlfriend, Christa Grühle. The wall would go up just months after his escape, turning what had been a difficult separation into what seemed like an impossible chasm. West Berlin was now an island of freedom in a sea of communism, and everyone Neumann loved was trapped on the other side. For many people, this would have been the end of the story, a tragic but final separation. But Joachim Neumann was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. He was an engineer, trained to solve problems, and he would apply that same determination to the problem of the Berlin Wall. In West Berlin, Neumann quickly found that he was not alone in his determination to help those trapped in the East. The Free University was full of students who had escaped or who had family members still behind the wall. One of them was Wolfgang Fuchs, who would become the principal organizer of what would be known as Tunnel 57. Another was Reinhard Furrer, a physics student who would go on to become an astronaut, but who in 1964 was just a determined young man with a shovel and a dream of freedom. There was Klaus von Kausler, a law student who served as a runner, communicating with those in the East who wanted to escape. Ralph Kabisch was there too, another young idealist who believed that the wall was not just a physical barrier, but a moral abomination that had to be challenged. In total, 35 West Berliners, most of them students, would participate in the construction of Tunnel 57.
Joachim Neumann's first attempt to help people escape ended in disaster. A disaster that would only steel his resolve and make him more determined than ever. He and a group of fellow students had dug a tunnel and made contact with people in East Berlin who wanted to escape, including Christa Grühle. They had been careful, methodical, and secretive, but they had not been careful enough. Someone informed the Stasi. When the refugees arrived at the arranged location, expecting to find freedom, they found instead armed guards waiting to arrest them. Christa was among those caught. She was sentenced to 16 months in prison, 16 months in the brutal conditions of an East German jail where political prisoners were subjected to psychological torture, isolation, and constant interrogation designed to break their will and turn them into informants for the state. For many people, such a failure would have been devastating enough to give up, to accept that the wall was simply too formidable, the Stasi too omnipresent, the risks too great. But Neumann did not give up. If anything, the arrest of the woman he loved made him more determined. He joined another group of students who were planning what would become the most ambitious tunnel project ever attempted in Berlin. They would dig deeper than anyone had dug before. They would dig longer than anyone had dug before. They would take every precaution, plan for every contingency, and they would succeed where others had failed. The tunnel would be known by the number of people it saved, Tunnel 57. In April of 1964, the 35 members of the tunnel team began their work. They had found the perfect starting point, an abandoned bakery at 97 Bernauer Strasse in the French sector of West Berlin. Bernauer Strasse was one of the most dramatic locations along the wall. The street itself was the border, with buildings on the eastern side having been evacuated and their windows bricked up to prevent escapes. Some desperate people had jumped from these buildings in the early days before the wall was completed, and West Berlin firefighters had held nets to catch them. Now those buildings stood empty, silent monuments to a divided city. The bakery's basement provided the perfect cover for a tunnel entrance, and its location meant that if they dug in the right direction, they could potentially reach beneath the wall and emerge somewhere in East Berlin. The technical challenges were enormous. They would need to dig to a depth of 12 meters or 39 feet to ensure they passed well below the wall's foundations and any underground sensors or monitoring equipment that the East Germans might have installed. The tunnel would need to be at least 145 meters long, or 476 feet, roughly the length of 1.5 football fields, to reach from Bernauer Strasse all the way to a safe location inside East Berlin, where refugees could be gathered without arousing suspicion. The tunnel would need to be small enough that digging could be done relatively quickly and quietly, but large enough that people could crawl through it. They settled on dimensions of approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet high, just barely enough space for an adult to squeeze through on hands and knees. The work was back-breaking and brutal. The men worked in shifts that sometimes lasted for weeks. They slept in the abandoned bakery, taking turns digging, hauling dirt, and shoring up the tunnel walls to prevent collapse. The dirt they excavated was packed into flour sacks left over from the bakery's days of operation, and these sacks were piled up in the basement, creating mountains of evidence that would have damned them all if the tunnel had been discovered before completion. The men were constantly filthy, covered in a mix of mud, sweat, and groundwater that seeped into the tunnel. As Joachim Neumann would later recall with a laugh, "We stunk." They washed occasionally with buckets of water, but there was no escaping the grime and the claustrophobia of working in a space so small that you could barely turn around, lit only by dim electric bulbs strung along the tunnel's length, breathing air that grew stale and thin the farther into the tunnel you went. It took 6 months to complete the tunnel, 6 months of grueling work, of aching muscles and bleeding hands, of constant fear that the Stasi would discover what they were doing. They knew that other tunnel projects had been betrayed by informants. They knew that the East German government offered substantial rewards to anyone who reported escape attempts. They knew that at any moment their tunnel might break through into a basement full of armed guards. But they persevered, driven by a belief that freedom was worth any sacrifice, any risk, any amount of suffering. By early October of 1964, the tunnel was finally complete. It emerged, by remarkable good fortune, in a disused outhouse in the rear courtyard of an apartment building at 55 Strelitzerstrasse in East Berlin. The location was perfect, secluded, away from the street, and unlikely to be under constant surveillance.
The organizers of the tunnel had made contact with 120 people in East Berlin who wanted to escape. These were people who were willing to risk everything, including their lives, for a chance at freedom. They included whole families with small children, young people who wanted to pursue educations and careers denied to them under communism, and older people who simply wanted to live their final years in a free society. The organizers employed couriers, people who could move between East and West Berlin under various pretexts to communicate with the refugees and coordinate the escape. They assigned a code word that would identify participants in the operation: Tokyo, chosen because the 1964 Summer Olympics were about to begin in the Japanese capital, providing a plausible reason why someone might mention the city in conversation. On October 3, 1964, the escape operation began. The refugees had been given careful instructions. They were to arrive at 55 Strelitzerstrasse at specific times, pretending to be making normal Sunday evening visits to acquaintances who lived in the building. This was crucial because the building was located just meters away from a border guard post, close enough that the guards could easily see anyone entering or leaving. The refugees had to act naturally, casually, as if they had no care in the world beyond visiting friends. Any sign of nervousness, any suspicious behavior could doom not only themselves, but everyone involved in the operation. To add an extra layer of security, a lookout was positioned on the roof of a tall building in West Berlin with binoculars, watching the street approach to 55 Strelitzerstrasse. If anything seemed wrong, if border guards appeared to be watching the building or setting up a trap, the lookout would shine a gold-colored light as a warning signal.
One of the refugees was a young man named Andreas Springer, just 21 years old, who left behind a detailed account of his escape that captures the sheer terror and desperate hope that characterized these operations. Springer had grown up in Dreilinden, a Berlin suburb so close to the border that it was considered a restricted area after the wall went up. He had been rejected from art schools because he was Catholic, because he had not joined the Young Pioneers or the Free German Youth, the communist organizations that young people were expected to join, and because he had 3 brothers who had already fled to the West. He faced growing pressure to join the army, a prospect he dreaded, and he had been arrested by border guards simply for picking mushrooms in the forest, accused of looking for escape routes. His mother, worried that Andreas would get himself killed trying to escape on his own, had reached out to his brothers in West Berlin, Klaus and Ulrich, pleading with them to help. The Springer brothers had initially considered trying to smuggle Andreas out, hidden in a car, but they abandoned that plan after hearing that someone attempting a similar escape had been caught. Then, in mid-1963, they made contact with a West Berliner named Gerd, who could move freely across the border and who worked secretly as a guide for escape operations. For more than a year, Andreas heard nothing. Then, on Sunday, October 4, 1964, he met Gerd again. The escape, Gerd told him, would happen that very night. No further details were provided, and Andreas had no idea how he would be getting to the West. He did not know about the tunnel. The organizers had learned from previous operations that the less the refugees knew, the safer everyone would be. If someone was caught and interrogated by the Stasi, they could not reveal what they did not know. Andreas Springer spent what he believed might be his last evening in East Germany, having dinner with Gerd at a restaurant called Ganymed. He used his last East German money to order chicken fricassee on rice and a bottle of Hungarian Tokaji wine. As he would later recall, "To me, this dinner felt like the last meal of a death row inmate." About 40 minutes before midnight, they began walking toward Strelitzer Strasse. Springer's heart was pounding so hard he was sure the border guards could hear it. Gerd left him with instructions. Enter number 55, go to the backyard, and say the code word Tokyo. What happened next was almost comically terrifying. Springer walked down the left side of the street, counting house numbers, 53, 54, and then nothing. Number 55 simply was not there, or at least he could not find it in the dark. Panicking, he entered a nearby building, climbed to the 3rd floor, and waited, trying to calm his racing heart, acutely aware that just 30 feet away, border guards were stationed in their booth, watching. Gerd had told him that if there was a problem, he should wait 20 minutes and try again. So Springer hurried back to a nearby park where he had left a fashionable nylon coat from West Germany, put it on to change his appearance, ruffled his hair, and returned to the street. This time he found the entrance to 55 Strelitzer Strasse and made his way into the courtyard. A voice hissed at him from the darkness. "You should not have come with a rustling coat." The nylon coat, it seemed, was too loud, too conspicuous. "This is my 2nd try," Andreas whispered back. "I had to dress up." The voice told him to remove his shoes and put them in his pockets. In stockinged feet, Andreas padded across the courtyard to the derelict outhouse, where a man he didn't know pointed a flashlight down into a hole in the ground. At the bottom of the shaft, Andreas could see the entrance to the tunnel, a rectangular opening barely big enough for one person. Feet first, I climbed down the hole. I crawled forward like a bug on its back. After about 160 feet, I was able to turn around. It was better now, moving head first and on all fours. The tunnel was terrifyingly small, barely 2 feet high and 3 feet wide, the walls pressing in on all sides, the air thick and humid, lit only by dim electric bulbs strung along the ceiling. Springer crawled through the darkness, not knowing how far he had to go, not knowing if the tunnel would collapse on him, not knowing if border guards would discover the entrance behind him and open fire. He crawled through mud and pooled water, his hands and knees aching, his breathing labored in the stale air. And then finally, he reached the end. He found himself at the bottom of another 30-foot shaft. A rope with a wooden board attached, like a child's swing, was lowered down to him. He sat on the board and was pulled up, 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 until he emerged into the basement of the abandoned bakery at 97 Bernauerstrasse. He was in West Berlin. He was free. Andreas Springer would later describe the experience by saying, "I was a bean in a saucepan," a metaphor that captures both the absurdity and the terror of crawling through that claustrophobic tunnel towards an uncertain fate.
As the first groups of refugees crawled through the tunnel to freedom during that first night of October 3rd, the organizers worked with military precision, moving people through as quickly as possible while maintaining security. Reinhard Furrer, the physics student who would one day become an astronaut, positioned himself at the East Berlin end of the tunnel, in that outhouse in the courtyard of 55 Strelitzer Strasse. His job was to wait for refugees to arrive, whisper the code word Tokyo, and then guide them to the tunnel entrance. Other members of the team were stationed at various points along the tunnel, ready to help anyone who panicked or got stuck. Still others waited at the West Berlin end, ready to pull refugees up the final shaft and rush them to safety. By the end of that first night, dozens of people had successfully made the journey. But for Joachim Neumann, the most important escape had not yet happened. Christa Grühle, the woman he loved, the woman for whom he had helped build this tunnel, was still in prison, not scheduled for release until December, or so he thought. On October 4th, the day that would become the second and final night of the tunnel's operation, Neumann received an unexpected letter. It was from Christa. She had been released early from prison, her sentence reduced for reasons she did not fully understand. She was free, or at least as free as anyone could be in East Berlin. She was writing to tell Joachim that she was out, that she was alive, that she had survived her ordeal, but she knew nothing about the tunnel. She had no idea that at that very moment, just a few kilometers away, a passage to freedom was open and waiting. Neumann was electrified by the news. He scrambled to get word to Christa through the courier network, a desperate race against time, because he knew the tunnel could not stay open indefinitely. The longer it operated, the greater the chance that it would be discovered. Every hour increased the risk. But this was the woman he loved, the woman he had left behind when he escaped 3 years earlier, the woman who had been imprisoned because of a previous escape attempt. He could not, would not leave her behind now. The message reached Christa. Come tonight. Come to 55 Strelitzer Strasse. Say Tokyo and trust that freedom awaits. That evening, as darkness fell over divided Berlin, Christa Grühle walked up to the apartment building, just meters away from the border guards in their watchtower, whispered the code word to a stranger who materialized from the shadows, and was led to the outhouse in the courtyard. She climbed down into the tunnel, and she crawled through the darkness toward the west. This time, there were no Stasi agents waiting to arrest her. This time, there was no prison cell at the end of her journey. This time, she made it through. Joachim Neumann and Christa Grühle were reunited in West Berlin. They would later marry, and they would stay together for the rest of their lives. Love, it turned out, was stronger than the wall. But even as Christa Grühle was making her escape, the operation was beginning to unravel. Unbeknownst to the organizers, one of the 120 people they had contacted in East Berlin was a Stasi collaborator, an informant who had reported the entire operation to the secret police. The Stasi, in turn, had alerted the border guards. Shortly after midnight, as the second night of escapes continued, a lookout on the West Berlin building saw something that made his blood run cold. A car had stopped in front of 55 Strelitzer Strasse. 2 men got out and entered the building, but they did not turn on the lights inside, which was the signal that organizers were supposed to use to indicate it was safe. The lookout immediately alerted the team at the tunnel. Something was wrong. 2 Stasi officers in plainclothes had arrived at the courtyard entrance, claiming they wanted to escape and had a friend they needed to fetch to come along.
It was a ruse, and when they returned, it was not with a friend, but with uniformed border guards, armed and ready to arrest everyone involved. Reinhard Führer, who had been stationed at the East Berlin end of the tunnel to guide refugees, saw them coming and managed to retreat back into the outhouse and down into the tunnel, crawling as fast as he could through the narrow passage to warn the others. The helpers on the West Berlin side immediately called back the other team members who were in the tunnel, shouting for them to get out, to run, to save themselves. It was a desperate scramble in the darkness, men crawling frantically through the mud, knowing that armed guards were just behind them. In the confusion of the moment, as border guards burst into the courtyard and approached the outhouse, shots were fired. Christian Zobel, one of the tunnel helpers, had a pistol, as did some of the others. They had brought weapons precisely for a situation like this, knowing that if the tunnel was discovered, they might need to defend themselves and the refugees. Christian Zobel fired at the guards. One of his shots struck a 21-year-old East German border guard named Egon Schultz in the shoulder. Schultz fell to the ground. As he tried to get back up, still in the line of fire, another shot rang out. This one was fatal. Egon Schultz died on the way to the hospital. He became the 52nd known person to die at the Berlin Wall. The East German government immediately seized upon Schultz's death for propaganda purposes. The next day, the state-controlled press reported West Berlin terrorists had murdered a heroic border guard. The Socialist Unity Party, the communist dictatorship that ruled East Germany, made Egon Schultz a martyr, a victim of the capitalist enemy's ruthless violence. His death was used to justify the wall, to justify the shoot-to-kill orders, to justify the entire apparatus of oppression that kept 17 million East Germans imprisoned in their own country. Schultz's funeral was a state affair, with full military honors, and his name was invoked for years afterwards as proof of Western aggression. Christian Zobel, the tunnel helper who had fired the shot that wounded Schultz, believed for the rest of his life that he had killed the young guard. He died in the 1980s, carrying that guilt with him to his grave. But the truth was very different, and it would not emerge until after German reunification, when Stasi archives were opened and could be examined by historians. Egon Schultz had not been killed by a bullet from Christian Zobel's gun. He had been killed by friendly fire, shot by one of his fellow border guards in the chaos of the moment. The East German government had known this all along. They had Schultz's autopsy report, which clearly showed the trajectory and nature of the fatal wound, and they had deliberately suppressed it, hiding the evidence because the truth did not serve their propaganda needs. For decades, they allowed the lie to stand, allowed Schultz to believe he was a killer, allowed the world to believe that the tunnel helpers were murderers, all to serve the political interests of a regime built on lies. The tunnel organizers were devastated by Schultz's death. They never wanted anyone to die. They were not terrorists or murderers. They were young students who believed in freedom, who believed that people should not be imprisoned by their own government, who believed that risking their own lives to help others escape was a moral imperative. In response to the East German propaganda, they sent balloons floating over the wall carrying a letter that read, "The causative murderer is the East German secret police. The real murderer is the system that addressed the massive flight of its citizens, not by removing the cause of the problem, but by building a wall and giving the order for Germans to shoot Germans." The tunnel was demolished by East German authorities, but it had already accomplished its purpose. By the time it was discovered, 57 people had crawled through its dark passage to freedom, making it the single most successful escape operation in the history of the Berlin Wall.
The fates of those involved in Tunnel 57 illustrate both the personal cost and the ultimate vindication of their efforts. Joachim Neumann and Christa Grula, whose love story threaded through the entire operation, married and stayed together, a testament to the power of human connection to overcome even the most formidable barriers. Reinhard Führer,
The young physics student who had guided refugees into the tunnel and barely escaped capture himself, continued his studies at the Free University in West Berlin. His brilliance and determination eventually led him to become an astronaut, flying on a space shuttle mission in 1985. The man who had once crawled through a tunnel beneath the Berlin Wall would go on to orbit the Earth, seeing from space a world without borders, a perspective that must have seemed impossibly distant on those dark October nights in 1964. Wolfgang Fuchs and Hassel Herschel, two of the principal organizers of Tunnel 57, did not stop with this one operation. They continued helping people escape from East Germany for years afterward, organizing other operations, taking other risks, driven by the conviction that freedom was worth fighting for. Klaus von Keusler, the law student who had served as a runner, similarly continued his work smuggling people across the border, using various creative methods to outwit the Stasi and the border guards. These men became part of a network of what the Germans called Fluchthelfer, escape helpers, people who dedicated themselves to undermining the wall and the system it represented. Andreas Springer, the young man who had almost failed to find the address and who described himself as a bean in a saucepan, realized his dream of becoming a graphic designer and photographer in West Berlin. For decades, he rarely spoke about his escape, keeping that terrifying night locked away in his memory. But in 1989, he had the opportunity to witness and photograph one of the most joyous moments in modern history, the fall of the Berlin Wall. After 28 years of dividing families, friends, and an entire nation, the wall was torn down by jubilant crowds celebrating the end of communist rule in East Germany. Springer captured those moments on film, images of people dancing on top of the wall, swinging sledgehammers at the concrete, embracing loved ones they had not seen in decades. It must have been a profoundly emotional experience for him, to see the barrier that had nearly cost him his life finally destroyed, to see the death strip that had claimed so many lives turned into a party, to see tyranny defeated. For Egon Scholz, there would be no such vindication. The young border guard remained a controversial figure, used as propaganda by the East German regime, and later, after the truth emerged, recognized as a victim of the very system he had been serving. A memorial plaque at 55 Strelitzerstrasse today commemorates both the successful escape through Tunnel 57 and Scholz's death, acknowledging the complex human tragedy that unfolded there. He was 21 years old, the same age as many of the refugees he was supposed to stop, a young man who might have questioned his orders, who might have wondered why Germans were being ordered to shoot Germans, but who ultimately became another casualty of the Cold War. The story of Tunnel 57 is more than just a remarkable escape story. It is a testament to the fundamental human drive for freedom. A drive so powerful that people will risk death, will endure months of back-breaking labor, will crawl through claustrophobic darkness toward an uncertain fate, simply for the chance to live in a free society. It is a reminder of why the Cold War mattered, why the United States and its allies stood firm against communist expansion, and why the defense of freedom is never a wasted effort. The 35 West Berliners who built that tunnel, who worked for 6 months in secret, who risked arrest and imprisonment and death, did so because they understood something fundamental. Freedom is not just an abstract concept, it is the most basic human right, and a government that must imprison its own people to prevent them from leaving has no legitimacy whatsoever. The numbers tell a stark story. Over the nearly 30 years that the Berlin Wall stood, approximately 100,000 people attempted to escape from East Germany. Around 5,000 succeeded in crossing the Berlin Wall specifically, using methods that ranged from the ingenious to the desperate. Hidden compartments in cars, tunnels, homemade hot air balloons, even a tightrope walker who crossed on a wire strung between buildings. But more than 100 people died in the attempt, shot by border guards, killed by landmines, drowned while trying to swim across rivers, or dead from other causes related to their escape attempts. An estimated 250,000 more were imprisoned for attempting to flee. These statistics represent individual human tragedies, families destroyed, lives ended or ruined, all because a totalitarian regime refused to allow its citizens the most basic freedom, the freedom to leave. Tunnel 57 saved 57 lives in just 2 nights of operation. To put that in perspective, those 57 people represented nearly 1/5 of all successful tunnel escapes over the entire history of the wall. More than 70 tunnels were started during those years, but only 19 were successful. The tunnel built by Joachim Neumann, Wolfgang Fuchs, Reinhard Furr, and their companions was the longest, at 145 meters. It was the deepest, at 12 meters below ground, and it was the most successful, judged by the metric that mattered most: human lives saved. Each of those 57 people was a world unto themselves, with dreams and hopes and loved ones who mourned their absence. Each represented a family reunited, a future reclaimed, a life lived in freedom rather than captivity. The financing of the tunnel is also instructive. It was partially funded by selling film and photo rights to Western media organizations, with the largest single contribution of about 30,000 Deutschmarks coming from the West German Federal Ministry of Intra-German Relations. This was not a government operation, not a military mission, but a grassroots effort by ordinary citizens that received some governmental support. It represents the best of what democratic societies can do: empower individuals to take action in defense of human rights while providing resources and support where needed. The Stasi, despite all its resources, despite its vast network of informants, despite its technological surveillance capabilities and its brutal efficiency, could not stop determined people from digging a hole in the ground. Today, if you visit Berlin, you can walk along Bernauer Street, where the memorial to the Berlin Wall now stands. The street that was once the border between two worlds, where families were divided and people died trying to escape, is now a place of remembrance and education. The memorial includes a preserved section of the wall, a documentation center with exhibits about escape attempts, and markers showing where tunnels were dug. At 55 Strelitzerstrasse, now part of the trendy Prenzlauer Berg neighborhood, you will find the memorial plaque commemorating Tunnel 57. It is a modest marker for such an extraordinary event, but perhaps that is fitting. The people who built the tunnel were not seeking glory or recognition. They were simply doing what they believed was right, what conscience demanded, what freedom required. As Americans, we should remember Tunnel 57 not just as a dramatic Cold War story, but as vindication of the principles our nation has always stood for. When President Reagan stood at the Berlin Gate in 1987 and challenged Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall, he was speaking for all the people who had fought against that wall, all the people who had died because of that wall, all the people like Joachim Neumann and his companions who had refused to accept that wall's existence as legitimate. 2 years later, the wall did fall, not because of military action, but because the human spirit's desire for freedom could not be contained forever, because tyranny eventually collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, and because the free world, led by the United States, never wavered in its commitment to the principle that all people deserve to live in freedom. The story of Tunnel 57 reminds us that history is not made only by presidents and generals, by diplomats and politicians. It is made by ordinary people who do extraordinary things, by students with shovels who dig for 6 months through darkness and fear, by young men and women who risk everything for love and freedom, by refugees who crawl through mud toward an uncertain future, because even that uncertainty is preferable to the certainty of captivity.
These are the real heroes of the Cold War, and their victory was not just the 57 lives saved in October of 1964, but the eventual fall of the entire rotten edifice of European communism. Freedom won, tyranny lost, and we should never forget the price that was paid or the courage that was required to achieve that victory.